The Duke of Marrowhall had not tasted his own food in 3 years. Every evening, the same ritual played out in the same cold dining room. A footman set down a plate. Duke Ronan Ashgrave lifted his fork. He chewed. He swallowed. And he felt nothing at all, no warmth, no pleasure, nothing but the mechanical act of keeping himself alive. The staff had stopped asking if the meal was satisfactory. There was no point. The answer was always the same silence, followed by a plate pushed half-finished toward the edge of the table. The candles would burn low, the clock on the mantel would tick through the hour, and Ronan would sit alone at a table built to seat 20, staring at nothing in particular until it was time to retreat to his study and pretend to work. That morning, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, stood in the servants' hall holding a letter with trembling hands. "He's dismissed the 4th cook this year," she said. "Sacked her before she'd even unpacked her knives." The younger maids exchanged glances. Everyone in Marrowhall knew the rumor, though no one spoke it directly to the Duke's face, that something had broken in him the year his wife died, and that it had taken his appetite along with everything else he used to care about. Some said he'd stopped visiting the stables because the horses reminded him of rides he used to take with her. Others whispered that he'd had her portrait moved from the gallery to a locked room, unable to bear looking at it, yet unwilling to let it go entirely. It was into this house, on a grey Tuesday morning, that a young woman named Wren Calder arrived with a single travel case and a letter of introduction that wasn't entirely honest. She had not trained in any grand kitchen. She had learned to cook from her grandmother, in a small stone cottage on the coast, where every ingredient had to be coaxed into flavor because there was rarely enough of it to waste. Her grandmother used to say that the poorest kitchens produced the most honest food, because there was no room for pretense when a meal had to actually nourish someone. Wren had carried that lesson with her long after the cottage burned down 2 winters ago, taking half her family's savings with it. She had taken this position not because she dreamed of serving a duke, but because her family's debts had grown too large to ignore, and Marrowhall paid better than anywhere else within a day's ride. Her mother had wept when she left, and her younger brother had walked her to the crossroads in silence, both of them understanding without needing to say it that there was no other choice left to make. She did not know about the 3 dismissed cooks. She did not know about the Duke's dead wife, or the silence that had swallowed the house since. She only knew she needed to keep this job, whatever it took, and that a girl who arrived nervous and apologetic rarely lasted long in a house like this one. Mrs. Pruitt looked her over with visible doubt. "You're younger than the others." "I can cook," Wren said simply. "Give me 1 meal to prove it." "1 meal is usually all you get here," Mrs. Pruitt muttered, but something in the girl's steady gaze made her relent. "Fine. Tonight. Don't waste the good cuts of meat, we can't afford to lose more than we already have." Wren spent the rest of the afternoon simply watching the kitchen, learning its rhythms, its quirks, the particular way the old iron stove ran hotter on one side than the other. She asked the scullery maid, a quiet girl named Hetty, what the Duke had liked to eat before, anything at all, some clue to work from. Hetty only shrugged. "Nothing, as far as anyone remembers. Not for a long while." That evening, Wren stood in the kitchen and stared at the pantry, and made a decision that would have horrified the previous cooks. She ignored the expensive cuts entirely. Instead, she reached for a battered pot, a handful of root vegetables, and a recipe that had no name beyond what her grandmother used to call it: the Mendes stew, made for fishermen who came home cold and hollowed out after bad seasons at sea. It wasn't refined. It wasn't the kind of dish meant to impress a nobleman. But it was the only thing she knew how to make with her whole heart, and something told her that was exactly what this house needed. If you're already wondering what's inside that pot, and whether it's about to change everything in this house, subscribe to the channel and comment appetite below. Now, let's see what happens when that plate reaches the Duke's table. At exactly 7 o'clock, the footman carried the tray into the dining room, uncertain whether he was about to witness another failure. The Duke didn't look up. He rarely did anymore. He simply sat with his hands folded, waiting out the meal the way a man waits out a chore he no longer remembers choosing. He lifted his spoon out of habit rather than hunger, expecting the usual blandness that passed for excellence in this house. The first taste stopped him completely still. For a moment, he said nothing. The footman, watching from the doorway, felt his stomach drop, certain the Duke was about to demand the cook's dismissal on the spot. He had seen that same stillness before, right before Ronan set down his fork and quietly said the word enough. Instead, Ronan set his spoon down very slowly, and asked a question no one in that dining room had heard him ask in 3 years. Who made this? The footman hesitated, unsure whether the question was a prelude to punishment or something else entirely. The new girl, Your Grace. Wren called her. She started this morning. Ronan said nothing for a long moment. He looked down at the stew again, as though checking that it was real, that he hadn't imagined the sudden, startling sensation of actually wanting to eat. He took a second spoonful, then a third, and something in his chest loosened that he hadn't realized had been clenched shut for years. Send her up, he said finally. Word traveled through the servants' hall faster than anyone could stop it. By the time Mrs. Pruitt found Wren scrubbing pots in the scullery, her face had gone pale. He wants to see you. Now. Wren wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering. In her experience, being summoned by a nobleman after a meal rarely meant good news. She walked the long corridor toward the dining room, bracing herself for dismissal, already composing the apology she would give her mother when she returned home without wages. She counted the portraits along the hallway to steady her nerves, stone-faced ancestors in old-fashioned collars, none of them offering any comfort at all. Instead, she found the Duke sitting perfectly still, the empty bowl in front of him, studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't immediately solve. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his early 30s, and there was nothing cruel in his expression, only a kind of quiet exhaustion that seemed to live permanently behind his eyes, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for far too long without ever setting it down. You made this, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Your Grace. I hope it was. Where did you learn it? The bluntness caught her off guard. My grandmother. It isn't a noble dish. It's fisherman's food. I didn't think. It's the first thing I've tasted in 3 years, he said. The words landed strangely in the room, too honest for a man of his rank to say to a servant he'd known for less than a day. Wren didn't know what to do with them, so she said nothing, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other across the space between the table and the doorway. You'll cook for me again tomorrow, he said. It wasn't a request. Yes, Your Grace. And Miss Calder, he paused, as though the next sentence cost him something. Thank you. She left the room in a daze, and it wasn't until she reached the kitchen that Mrs. Pruitt grabbed her by the shoulders, demanding to know what had happened, refusing to believe that the Duke of Marrow Hall had said thank you to anyone in living memory. Hetty, listening from the corner, went so far as to cross herself, as though something faintly miraculous had occurred within the house. What none of the staff knew, what even Wren herself didn't yet understand, was that the Mendes stew had done more than satisfy a craving. It had cracked something loose in a man who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of feeling nothing at all. Over the following days, a strange new rhythm took hold of the house. Wren cooked simple, honest meals, drawing from memory rather than instruction, dishes meant for hard winters and harder losses, food built to comfort rather than impress. And each evening, Ronan ate every bite, sometimes lingering at the table long after the plates had been cleared, as though reluctant to let the feeling go. The other servants began to notice smaller changes too. He asked after the stable master's injured hand, something he hadn't done in over a year. He walked the gardens in the mornings instead of remaining shut in his study until noon. Once, astonishingly, one of the younger maids heard him laugh, a short, rusty sound, as though the muscles required for it had gone unused for so long they'd nearly forgotten how. Even the tenant farmers who came to the estate office noticed a difference in him, a straighter posture, a steadier voice, questions asked with genuine interest rather than obligation. But not everyone in Marrow Hall welcomed the change. His cousin, Lord Desmond Ashgrave, arrived unannounced 11 days after Wren's arrival, ostensibly to check on family business. He found Ronan in the garden, standing over a row of herbs Wren had asked to be planted for the kitchen, looking more animated than Desmond had seen him in years. Desmond's smile didn't reach his eyes. You seem well, cousin. Almost like your old self. I am well, Ronan said simply. And to what do we owe this recovery? Ronan didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, Desmond's gaze drifted toward the kitchen window, where a young woman in a plain apron was visible, laughing at something one of the scullery maids had said. Something shifted in Desmond's expression, brief, calculating, gone before anyone could name it. How curious, he said quietly, that a maid should succeed where physicians failed. Desmond stayed at Marrow Hall longer than his stated business required, and Wren noticed him watching her more than once, not with the casual disinterest most nobles showed the staff, but with a careful, measuring attention that made her uneasy. He asked Mrs. Pruitt idle-sounding questions about the new cook, where she'd come from, whether she had family nearby, how long she intended to stay, questions that seemed harmless enough on their own, but that Mrs. Pruitt found herself repeating to Wren with a small frown, unsure why they'd bothered her. Wren said nothing of it to Ronan. It wasn't her place, and besides, she had more immediate concerns. The kitchen budget was thinner than she liked, the pantry stores were dwindling faster than expected, and Mrs. Pruitt had begun hinting that the estate's finances were tighter than anyone upstairs wanted to admit. None of that stopped Ronan from finding reasons to visit the kitchen himself, an unheard-of habit for a man of his station. He told himself it was to discuss the following day's meals. In truth, he simply wanted to watch her work, the quick, sure movements of her hands, the way she tasted everything twice before deciding it was right, the low hum of a tune she didn't seem to know she was singing. "You don't cook like someone trained in a great house," he observed one evening, leaning against the doorframe while she chopped herbs. "I wasn't," she said. "I cooked for people who'd had a hard day and needed something that felt like being cared for. That's all food ever really is, isn't it? A way of saying someone thought about you." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. "No one has cooked for me that way in a very long time." It wasn't self-pity in his voice, just fact, stated plainly, the way a man might mention an old injury that had simply become part of how he moved through the world. Wren set down her knife. "Can I ask what happened? To make you stop tasting things?" She expected him to deflect, as noblemen so often did. Instead, he told her, haltingly, in fragments, about his wife, Elira, who had died in a fever 3 winters past, and about the strange numbness that had followed, as though grief had simply eaten every other feeling alongside it. He told her about the last meal Elira had shared with him, a simple breakfast neither of them had thought to remember carefully at the time, and how he'd spent a year afterward trying to recall the exact taste of it, certain that if he could just remember, some part of her would still be close. "I kept eating because I had to," he said. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped tasting anything at all. I told myself it didn't matter. A duke doesn't need to enjoy his dinner to run an estate." "But you missed it," Wren said. "Not a question. More than I let myself admit." The kitchen was quiet except for the low crackle of the fire. Wren realized, with a start, that she'd stopped chopping entirely, simply listening, and that he'd stopped watching the herbs and was watching her instead. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "Thank you for asking," he replied. "No one else has, in 3 years." A few evenings later, he found her in the garden after dark, unable to sleep, sitting among the herb beds she'd planted with her own hands. He sat beside her without asking permission, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Eventually he asked about her grandmother, about the cottage by the sea, about the recipes she carried with no names beyond memory. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone since arriving, about the fire that took the cottage, about her mother's failing health, about the fear that had walked beside her every mile of the road to Marrow Hall. He listened the way almost no one had ever listened to her, without impatience, without waiting for his turn to speak. It was Mrs. Pruitt who found them there, minutes after the second such evening, and though nothing improper had occurred, she felt compelled to gently remind Wren, later that night, that a maid's position in this house depended on certain boundaries being kept. "He's a good man," Mrs. Pruitt said, "but he's still a duke, and you're still staff. Whatever's happening between you two, be careful, girl. Houses like this one don't forgive mistakes easily." Wren took the warning seriously. She began keeping their conversations shorter, more professional, more careful. But it was too late to undo what had already begun growing between them, not romance yet, not exactly, but something quieter and just as dangerous. The sense of being known by someone, after years of feeling invisible. 3 nights later, Wren discovered something that made her rethink everything Mrs. Pruitt had warned her about. While searching the pantry for a missing ledger of supplies, she found an old letter tucked behind a flour tin, water-stained and clearly hidden rather than misplaced. It bore Lord Desmond's seal, and though she knew she shouldn't read another person's correspondence, one line caught her eye before she could stop herself. "Once the estate's debts come due, Ronan will have no choice but to sell Marrow Hall to cover them. See that nothing delays this." Wren's hands went cold. She didn't understand the full meaning of what she was reading, but she understood enough to know that someone was working against the Duke, and that whatever was happening to Marrow Hall's finances wasn't accidental at all. Wren didn't sleep that night. She turned the letter over in her mind again and again, trying to decide what to do with information that wasn't hers to have. She thought of tearing it up, of pretending she'd never seen it, of simply returning it to its hiding place and forgetting the whole matter. But every time she tried to picture herself doing nothing, she thought of Ronan sitting alone at that long table for 3 years, and she couldn't make herself set the letter down. If she brought it to Ronan directly, she risked revealing that she'd been searching through places she had no business searching. If she said nothing, she risked letting whatever Desmond was planning unfold unchallenged. In the end, it was Ronan who came to her, 2 days later, his expression grim in a way she hadn't seen since her first week at Marrow Hall. "The estate's accounts are worse than I believed," he told her, finding her alone in the kitchen garden. "Desmond has been managing certain investments on my behalf since Elira died. I trusted him with it because I couldn't bear to look at the ledgers myself. It seems that trust was a mistake." Wren's stomach tightened. What kind of mistake? "Loans taken against the estate. Debts I never authorized. If they aren't repaid within the month, Marrow Hall itself could be forfeit." He rubbed a hand across his face, looking suddenly older than his years. "And Desmond, conveniently, is the only relative with the funds to rescue the estate, in exchange for a controlling stake in everything I own." This was her moment, and she knew it. She could stay silent and let him discover the rest on his own, or she could risk everything by telling him what she'd found. "There's something I need to show you," she said, and led him to the pantry, retrieving the hidden letter with hands that trembled only slightly. Ronan read it twice, his face going through several expressions: confusion, then dawning understanding, then something colder and more dangerous than either. "His engineered this," Ronan said quietly. "The debts. The timing. All of it." "I shouldn't have been looking through the pantry stores," Wren admitted. "I wasn't trying to pry into family matters. I found it by accident." "I'm glad you did." He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, not from fear but from something far more complicated. "You've given me the first real advantage I've had in this since it started." But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different problems. The letter alone wasn't enough. Desmond would simply claim it was taken out of context, or forged, or stolen. They needed something more concrete, proof that connected him directly to the manufactured debts. Over the following days, Ronan quietly began reviewing every transaction Desmond had made on the estate's behalf, working late into the night with Wren often bringing him small plates of food to keep him from forgetting to eat entirely. An echo, neither of them mentioned aloud, of how this had all begun. She would set the plate down without a word and sit across from him while he worked, sometimes reading over his shoulder, sometimes simply keeping him company through the long, frustrating hours of sorting fact from fabrication. More than once, it was Wren who noticed something he'd overlooked: a date that didn't align, a signature slightly too neat, a payment recorded twice under different names. It was during one of these long nights that Desmond returned to Marrow Hall unexpectedly, claiming he'd come to discuss the impending debts and offer his assistance. He found Ronan and Wren together in the study, papers spread across the desk between them, and something in his expression shifted the moment he saw what they were reviewing. "Going through old accounts, cousin?" Desmond's voice was light, but his eyes had gone sharp. "Tedious work for a duke. Surely that's what stewards are for." "I find I prefer understanding my own affairs these days," Ronan replied evenly. "Strange, the things a person notices once they start paying attention again." Desmond's gaze flicked toward Wren, cold and assessing, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt genuinely afraid of him. "How fortunate," Desmond said softly, "that the kitchen maid has taken such an interest in estate finance." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, even wrapped in polite phrasing, and Wren understood in that moment that she was no longer simply a witness to this conflict. She had become a target within it. Desmond left Marrow Hall that night without waiting for dinner, and the absence felt more ominous than any threat he might have spoken aloud. "He'll move faster now," Ronan said, watching the carriage disappear down the drive. "He knows we suspect him. We don't have the luxury of time anymore." Together, they worked through what remained of the night, cross-referencing the falsified loan documents against the estate's true records, until Wren, who had spent years keeping careful household ledgers for her own struggling family, noticed a discrepancy no one else had caught. The signatures on 3 separate loan agreements didn't quite match, the pen strokes too rushed, too uniform, clearly copied rather than genuinely signed. "He forged your signature," she said, staring at the pages. "This isn't just mismanagement, Ronan. This is fraud." For the first time in the entire ordeal, something like hope broke across his face. "That changes everything," he said. "Forgery isn't a family dispute the courts will ignore. It's a crime." They spent the following 2 days quietly gathering additional evidence: correspondence between Desmond and a moneylender in the nearest town, a discrepancy in dates that placed one supposed signing in a location Ronan could prove he had never visited that season, and a groundskeeper willing to admit, reluctantly, that he'd once carried sealed papers to Desmond's estate at odd hours without ever knowing what they contained. Piece by piece, the fabricated debts began to look less like an unfortunate misunderstanding and more like exactly what they were. Within the week, Ronan brought the evidence before the regional magistrate, along with 2 independent document examiners who confirmed what Wren had first noticed. Desmond, confronted with irrefutable proof, tried first to deny it, then to explain it away as a misunderstanding, but the numbers told a story too clear to dismiss. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place in the same study where the scheme had nearly succeeded. Desmond stood before Ronan, stripped of the composed arrogance he'd worn like armor throughout the entire affair. "I did what I had to," Desmond said, his voice tight with something between anger and desperation. "You barely functioned after Elira died. I told myself I was protecting the estate, protecting the family name, until you were capable of managing it yourself again. And then you never became capable again, until her." His eyes cut toward Wren with open resentment. "A kitchen maid undid 3 years of careful work." "She didn't undo anything," Ronan said quietly. "She reminded me who I used to be before grief made me easy to rob. That's not her fault, Desmond. That's yours." Desmond opened his mouth as if to argue further, then seemed to realize, all at once, that there was nothing left to argue. Whatever justification he had built for himself over 3 long years collapsed quietly in that room, leaving only the plain fact of what he had done. The magistrate's judgment came swiftly. Desmond was stripped of his position within the estate's affairs and ordered to repay what he'd stolen through forged claims, though the deeper wound, a family bond broken by greed and resentment, would take far longer to mend, if it ever fully did. He left Marrow Hall 2 days later, and though Ronan watched the carriage go with a heaviness in his chest, he found, to his own quiet surprise, that it no longer felt like grief. It felt like something closing. In the weeks that followed, Marrow Hall began to feel like a different house entirely. The heaviness that had lived in its halls for 3 years seemed to lift a little more each day, as though the building itself had been waiting for permission to breathe again. Windows that had stayed shuttered through long winters were open to let in the spring air. The locked room where Elira's portrait had been kept was finally reopened, not out of obligation, but because Ronan found he could look at her face again without the old ache pulling him under, only a quiet gratitude for the years they'd had. Ronan found Wren in the kitchen garden one evening, gathering herbs for the next day's meal, and stood watching her for a long moment before she noticed him. "I owe you more than I can properly say," he told her. "You didn't just feed me, Wren. You gave me back a version of myself I thought was gone for good." "You would have found your way back eventually," she said, though she didn't quite believe it herself. "Perhaps. But I don't think I would have wanted to, without someone showing me it was worth the effort." He hesitated, and for a man who commanded an entire estate, he suddenly looked uncertain in a way she found almost endearing. "I know what Mrs. Pruitt would say about the difference in our stations. I've thought about it more than I probably should. But I find I no longer care to let it decide anything for me." Wren set down the basket of herbs, her heart beating unsteadily. "And what would you have decided instead?" He said simply. "If you're willing." She thought of the mender's stew, and the cold stone cottage where she'd learned to cook it, and the debts that had first sent her walking through Marrow Hall's gates as a stranger with nothing to offer but a recipe and steady hands. She thought of how far that single pot of stew had carried them both. "I think," she said slowly, a smile breaking across her face, "that I'd like that very much." A year later, Marrow Hall's kitchen still smelled of the same simple, honest cooking that had once startled a grieving duke back into feeling something again, though now the cook stood beside her husband rather than merely serving him, and the household staff had long since stopped whispering about the difference in their stations. Mrs. Pruitt, who had once counseled caution above all else, was now the first to tell any newcomer proudly that she'd known, from the very first week, that something remarkable was happening under this roof. Wren's mother had come to live at Marrow Hall by then, her health mended by care the family could never have afforded on their own, and Wren's younger brother had taken up a position managing the estate stores, a quiet echo of the debts that had once threatened to break their family apart, now settled into something steadier than either of them had dared hope for. Ronan still remembered the first spoonful of that stew, the way it had cracked something open inside him he'd believed permanently sealed. He liked to say, whenever anyone asked how the Duke of Marrow Hall had fallen in love with his own kitchen maid, that it had never really been about the food at all. It had been about being seen, cared for, and remembered, the way only someone who truly paid attention could manage. And every evening, at exactly 7 o'clock, the table at Marrow Hall was never empty again. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more stories like this one and leave a like before you go. Tell me in the comments, do you think love can really start with something as simple as a shared meal? I'll be back soon with another story. I hope you'll be here for it.